She thought it would be just an awkward visit until she saw who her doctor really was. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. She hadn't stepped into a doctor's office in over 10 years. Not for a checkup. Not for a follow-up. Not even when the dull ache in her lower abdomen turned into something sharp, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. Claire Whitmore had avoided this moment with the kind of dedication most people reserve for religion. But when your body starts whispering in the middle of the night, and those whispers turn into screams, even the shyest woman has no choice but to listen. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what was waiting behind that door. The waiting room of the Magnolia Women's Wellness Center in Savannah, Georgia, was designed to be comforting. Pale sage walls, low lighting, soft classical music playing beneath the hum of a sleek espresso machine. Everything was carefully curated to soothe the nerves of its patients. But to Claire, it all felt like a trap, like a beautiful disguise for something she couldn't run from anymore. She sat in the furthest chair from the front desk, her legs crossed tightly, the clipboard in her lap half filled and trembling slightly. The pen in her hand had left a dot of ink where her fingers squeezed it too hard. She had written her name, her date of birth, and then stopped. Reason for your visit. Claire stared at the words, her mind blank. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because putting it into words made it real. It made her vulnerable in a way she wasn't ready for. She hated this, hated the smallness she felt in places like this. Her thoughts twisted themselves into knots as she tried to gather the courage to finish the form. The nurse called her name. She froze. Claire Whitmore? Her heart leapt into her throat. Slowly, she raised her eyes and stood. The clipboard felt heavy in her hands as she passed it to the nurse with a half smile and a quiet apology. Then she followed her down a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, her shoes silent against the polished floor, her stomach tightening with every step. "You can wait in here. The doctor will be in shortly," the nurse said, motioning her into a room that was far too elegant to belong to a medical clinic. Claire stepped inside, her senses overwhelmed by the smell of lavender and antiseptic, the soft hum of a hidden air vent, the sight of the sleek white exam chair looming in the corner like some kind of judgment. She sat rigidly in the chair across from the desk. Her hands twisted together in her lap. Her throat was dry. She rehearsed what she would say in her head, tried to calm the storm of self-consciousness and fear that built inside her like a pressure valve threatening to burst. She told herself it was just another doctor, just another appointment. She could do this. And then the door opened, and everything she thought she knew exploded in a single breathless instant. He wasn't supposed to look like that. The man who stepped into the room was tall, broad-shouldered, and far too young to be her doctor. His dark auburn hair was slightly tousled, like he had just run a hand through it. His features were strong, symmetrical, with a jawline that could have been sculpted by a Renaissance artist. But it wasn't just his looks. It was the way he moved, calm, assured, with a quiet authority that filled the room. His eyes, a warm hazel flecked with gold, landed on her and held steady. He smiled, just a hint, as he closed the door behind him. "Ms. Whitmore?" His voice was warm, professional, and alarmingly steady. "I'm Dr. Julian Cross." She blinked. Tried to say something. Nothing came out. He extended his hand, polite, formal. She shook it on instinct, immediately wishing she hadn't. His hand was warm, grounded, real. She wanted to disappear. "I see this is your first visit," he said, sitting across from her and opening her file. Claire could only nod. "I know these things can be intimidating," he said gently. "We'll go at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're completely comfortable. That's my promise." His voice was kind. Too kind. And that made it worse. Because it meant she couldn't even blame him for how he made her feel. Exposed, off balance, like the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become unreliable. She could barely breathe. And for the first time in her life, she was more afraid of what she was feeling than what she had come here to be treated for. If you're still here, and this story has caught you off guard in the best way, consider subscribing to our channel. It's your support that helps us continue bringing you stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. And trust us, you're going to want to see how Claire's story unfolds. Dr. Julian Cross was not the man Claire Whitmore had imagined. She had built an image in her head of someone older, clinical, detached, perhaps with silver hair and glasses, a man who spoke in terms so medical they built a wall between patient and doctor. But the person sitting across from her now was nothing like that. He didn't just look young. He was young. Too young, her anxious thoughts screamed. And he wasn't cold or distant. On the contrary, everything about him radiated warmth. It threw her completely off balance. Claire couldn't stop fidgeting. Her hands, which had found refuge in the hem of her cardigan, twisted the fabric with an urgency she couldn't control. She could feel his gaze, attentive, curious, but not invasive. He wasn't looking at her like a chart or a case study. He was seeing her, and for someone who had spent her life hiding in the background, it was nearly unbearable. Julian was reviewing her chart, his brow furrowed slightly, not with judgment, but concentration. When he finally looked up, he offered a gentle smile. "Claire, I want to thank you for being here today. I know it's not easy for everyone to come in for these things, especially when it's a first." She nodded, her voice still buried somewhere beneath a storm of emotion. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. No pressure, just whenever you're ready." His voice was soft, his tone neutral but compassionate. Claire nodded again, finally managing a whisper. "Okay." They spoke, slowly, cautiously. He asked simple things, and she gave him clipped answers. Yes, no, sometimes. But the longer he sat with her, the more the room changed. It didn't grow smaller. It grew safer. Julian never pushed. He never rushed her. He explained every step of what they were doing, offering her the choice to stop at any point. Claire had never expected kindness to feel so destabilizing. She didn't know how to receive it without wanting to retreat. When the appointment was over, he stood and offered her a final reassuring look. "We're done for today. You did really well." Claire mumbled a thank you, stood, and practically bolted out of the room, her face burning. She didn't know what had just happened, why her body felt light and her stomach twisted into nervous knots. It wasn't just the nature of the appointment. It was him. She had never in her life reacted to someone this way, let alone someone who had just spent 30 minutes discussing her most private health concerns. Her instincts screamed that she should stay far, far away from Julian Cross. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because of how right he had felt. how terrifyingly easy it had been to imagine something more, even for a second. Back outside, the spring air hit her like a wave. She walked without direction, down the charming cobbled streets of downtown Savannah, past hanging baskets of jasmine and the soft rustle of leaves above. The city was alive, but all Claire could hear was the echo of his voice in her mind. "We'll go at your pace." She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that. Not just in that moment, in her life. The next few days passed in a blur. She kept herself busy, organizing shelves at the library where she worked, preparing reading lists for the summer program, shelving returns with almost manic focus. But the harder she worked, the more persistent the memory became. She would catch herself staring into space, wondering what kind of man smiled like that without expecting anything in return. Who offered safety in a space where most people only offered facts and checklists? Then came the call. Her phone buzzed just past 7 p.m. as she was closing up the children's section. She didn't recognize the number, but she knew. It was the clinic. She didn't answer. The next morning, a voicemail confirmed it. Dr. Cross had requested a follow-up in 2 weeks. Standard procedure, the receptionist said kindly. Nothing urgent, just a check-in. Claire deleted the message. She wouldn't be going back. She told herself it was because she felt better. Because she didn't have the time. Because she was embarrassed. But none of that was true. The truth sat deeper, buried under years of self-protection. She had felt something in that room that frightened her more than any diagnosis ever could. Hope. And for someone like Claire Whitmore, who had built her entire life around staying invisible, hope was dangerous. She didn't want to go back and see him again. She didn't want to sit across from those warm eyes and feel the terrifying possibility that someone might see her as more than a patient, more than a quiet girl who kept to herself. But fate has a strange sense of humor, and it wasn't done with her yet. Claire Whitmore had become an expert at avoidance. It was a skill honed over years of staying invisible, of learning to disappear into the corners of rooms, of ducking out of social events before anyone noticed she was there. So when the reminder call from Magnolia Women's Wellness Center came again, followed by a gentle email from the receptionist about her follow-up appointment, she did what she knew best. She ignored it. She told herself it was just a minor issue, one she could manage on her own. She convinced herself the discomfort had lessened, that it would go away on its own. But in truth, it hadn't. In fact, it was getting worse, little by little, day by day. The tightness in her abdomen returned with a dull persistence, creeping into her nights and making her mornings slower, heavier. She doubled down on distraction. The library became her sanctuary again, a place where silence wasn't loneliness, but comfort. She immersed herself in work, taking on extra shifts and helping plan the upcoming local author reading. She smiled at children who came in wide-eyed, found joy in recommending books to strangers, and stacked return carts until her hands ached. Anything to avoid thinking about him, because it wasn't the appointment she feared. It was seeing Dr. Julian Cross again. The problem wasn't his professionalism, or his tone, or the kindness in his voice. The problem was that he had looked at her like she mattered. And Claire didn't know how to carry that, not from someone like him. It was easier to believe it had all been a misunderstanding. Easier to fold the memory up and tuck it away in the drawer, where she kept every other thing she didn't know how to deal with. But the drawer was overflowing now, and reality had begun to seep out. One morning, Claire stood in front of the mirror, brushing her teeth, when a sharp pain curled through her side and stopped her mid-motion. She gripped the sink, her breath shallow, and waited for it to pass. It did, eventually, but not before leaving a trail of dread in its wake. She knew she was being reckless. Ignoring symptoms didn't make them disappear. But knowing that and acting on it were two very different things, especially when shame was involved. The shame wasn't logical, but it was real. It lived in the way she flinched when the clinic number popped up on her phone, in the way her stomach dropped at the sound of his name, Julian Cross. Even thinking about him sent her heart into a tailspin, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd been so disarmingly good. She had left that room shaken, not by fear, but by possibility. And that possibility terrified her. What would it mean to be seen, to be known, to be cared for, not just as a patient, but as a person? Claire wasn't ready to answer those questions, but life didn't wait for readiness. 2 weeks after her missed appointment, she received a handwritten note in the mail. It was from the clinic, not from Dr. Cross directly, but clearly chosen with care. It was short, polite, and compassionate, a gentle reminder that follow-up care was part of healing, and that they were happy to reschedule at her convenience. No pressure. She held the note in her hands for several minutes, rereading it, unsure whether to feel touched or cornered. In the end, she tucked it inside the back of her journal, unable to throw it away. That night, the pain returned, stronger, sharper. She sat curled on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to read, trying to pretend everything was fine. But the words on the page blurred, and the ache in her gut grew too loud to ignore. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She didn't call. She just showed up. The Magnolia Women's Wellness Center was quiet that morning, the scent of lavender filling the air just as it had before. Claire stood at the front desk, her heart thudding in her chest, her fingers clenched around the strap of her purse. The receptionist recognized her instantly. "Claire, we're so glad to see you." Claire offered a faint smile. I need to reschedule my follow-up, if that's still okay." "Of course," the receptionist said, already pulling up the schedule. "You're in luck. Dr. Cross just had a cancellation. He can see you in 15 minutes if that works." Claire hesitated. Her first instinct was to flee, but she didn't. She nodded. "That works." She was led down the familiar hallway again, her body tense, her thoughts buzzing. When she was shown into the same room as last time, the memories surged back. The chair, the framed sunrise, the way he had said her name like it meant something. And then, as if on cue, the door opened. Julian stepped in, looking just as devastatingly calm and confident as he had the first time. Except this time, his smile softened when he saw her. "Claire," he said, his voice warm, a hint of surprise flickering in his eyes. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." Her breath caught. He wasn't accusing. He was teasing. Gently, kindly. But she heard the note beneath his words. The curiosity, maybe even the concern. She sank into the chair, eyes fixed on the floor. "I wasn't," she mumbled. Julian didn't push. He didn't need to. His presence alone did something strange to her, like the air in the room shifted just because he was in it. She wished she could disappear into the carpet, but she was here now. And this time, she had nowhere left to run. It had been 3 days since Claire Whitmore had last seen Dr. Julian Cross, and she was still trying to make sense of the quiet way his presence lingered. He hadn't done anything out of the ordinary during their second appointment. No grand gestures, no inappropriate remarks. Just the same gentle professionalism that made her feel both safe and impossibly unsettled. And yet something had shifted. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when he looked at her as if he knew she was on the edge of running again. And instead of trying to pull her back, he simply stayed where he was, patient, open. And somehow, that undid her more than anything else could have. Claire returned to the rhythm of her days at the library, but the rhythm felt off, like a song she'd heard too many times, suddenly sounding different. She shelved books, made coffee, answered questions at the reference desk, but her mind wandered, mostly to him, to the quiet tone of his voice, to the way he listened, really listened, like what she had to say actually mattered. She told herself it was just a passing infatuation, some emotional confusion stirred up by a vulnerable situation. But no matter how she tried to rationalize it, something about him stuck with her. Not just his appearance, though that certainly didn't help. It was deeper than that. A steadiness, a quiet kind of gravity. It was late April, and Savannah was entering one of its most beautiful stretches, warm enough to sit outside, breezy enough to feel alive. The Forsyth Park Book Fair was one of Claire's favorite events of the year. She always volunteered, helping with author signings and setting up tables for local vendors. It was one of the few places where she didn't feel out of place. Books were her refuge, and surrounded by others who loved them too, she could breathe a little easier. That morning, she arrived early, hair tied back in a loose knot, wearing a soft cotton dress and a tote bag slung across her shoulder, filled with bookmarks and snacks. The air was rich with the scent of gardenias. An early morning sun slipped through the live oaks that stretched over the park paths like sheltering arms. Claire set up her assigned booth, a table promoting historical fiction by regional authors, and began arranging stacks of paperbacks in neat rows. She was focused, absorbed in the comfort of the task when she felt it. That strange sensation, like someone was watching her, not in a threatening way, but in the way that made your skin aware before your mind caught up. She looked up, and there he was, Julian. He stood a few feet away, dressed in jeans and a light blue shirt, with the sleeves rolled up. No white coat, no clipboard, just a man, with one hand in his pocket, eyes soft with something she couldn't name. Their eyes locked for a moment. Claire forgot to breathe. He smiled first. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, walking over slowly, his tone casual, but his gaze anything but. Claire swallowed. "I could say the same." He glanced around, taking in the booths and the bustle. "I love this fair. Been coming for years, though I usually sneak in later in the day. Fewer crowds." She smiled, then quickly looked away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I volunteer every year." There was a pause, not awkward, but charged with something unspoken. Julian motioned to the books on her table. "Any recommendations?" Claire hesitated, then reached for a novel with a weathered cover. "This one's about a woman who rebuilds her life after everything falls apart. It's quiet, but beautiful." Julian accepted the book, turned it over in his hands. "Sounds like something I could learn from." Claire's eyes flicked up to meet his. He wasn't teasing. He meant it. They talked for a while. About books, about the city, about nothing and everything. And for the first time since their first appointment, Claire forgot to feel self-conscious. She forgot about how vulnerable she had been in his office. She forgot about the barrier she thought she had to keep between them. Julian wasn't acting like a doctor. He wasn't acting like someone who had seen her at her most exposed. He was just a man, standing in front of her, listening, genuinely interested. Eventually, he stepped back, holding the book she'd recommended. "I should let you get back to work, but would it be okay if I came back later? Maybe after your shift ends?" Claire hesitated. She could feel the panic trying to crawl back into her chest, the impulse to retreat, to say no, to protect herself from whatever this was becoming. But then she looked at him again, and for once, the fear wasn't louder than the hope. "Sure," she said softly. Julian smiled, and something in her chest unlocked. She watched him walk away, and for the first time in weeks, her breath came easier. She didn't know what this was, or where it might go. But she knew one thing. It was no longer something she could ignore. Claire Whitmore wasn't sure what compelled her to search his name. It happened late one night, a week after the book fair, when the house was still and the glow from her reading lamp cast long shadows across her bedroom walls. She had been lying in bed, pretending to read, but her mind kept circling the same thought. The way Julian had looked at her across that booth, the casual warmth in his voice, the way her heart had leapt when he said he'd come back later. He hadn't just been kind. He hadn't just been polite. There had been something in his expression, something careful, but unmistakably curious. Like he was seeing her for more than just a passing patient, more than just a quiet librarian from Savannah. And that, more than anything, had terrified her. So Claire did what countless people did when faced with the unknown. She Googled. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, but only for a moment. Dr. Julian Cross, Savannah gynecologist. She expected a handful of results, maybe a profile on the clinic's website, a few patient reviews. Nothing remarkable. What she found instead stopped her cold. Julian wasn't just a well-liked doctor. He was a figurehead. Julian Cross, MD, PhD, founder of Cross Wellness Foundation, heir to the Cross Healthcare Group, Forbes, 30 under 30, philanthropist, innovator, millionaire. Claire stared at the screen, her heart thudding louder with every word. She clicked on a featured article from Southern Living. There he was, smiling, confident, standing in front of one of the rural women's clinics he had opened last year. The story detailed how he'd used his family's vast fortune to expand access to gynecological care in underserved communities, how he had walked away from the corporate boardroom to practice medicine directly because he wanted to be useful, not just successful. Claire read every word, then read it again. The man who had sat across from her, who had leaned down to speak gently when she was too nervous to answer, who had come to a book fair just to ask for her recommendations. That man was a millionaire, a medical prodigy, a philanthropist with ties to one of the largest health networks in the Southeast. She felt sick, not because of who he was, but because of who she wasn't. She closed her laptop and sat in silence, a wave of shame rising like a tide. Her tiny apartment suddenly felt smaller. The stack of overdue bills on her kitchen table loomed in the corner of her eye. Her life, which had always felt modest but manageable, now felt utterly insignificant, ordinary. She had let herself believe, for the briefest moment, that someone like Julian could be interested in her, that maybe there was something real forming between them. But this changed everything. Julian Cross wasn't just successful. He was untouchable. Claire barely slept that night, and by morning, she had already begun to pull away. The first time Julian texted, she didn't respond. It wasn't anything romantic, just a simple message. "Hey, I saw that author you mentioned at the fair. You were right. Her prose is incredible." It made her smile, but she didn't reply. 2 days later, another message came. "Hope the week's going okay. If you ever want to grab a coffee or talk books again, I'd love that." Still, she said nothing. By the time the clinic called to confirm her next follow-up, she let the call go to voicemail, then deleted it without listening. She began rearranging her schedule to avoid the cafe where they might cross paths. She altered her route home from work. She even started taking her lunch in the library's back office just to avoid any possibility of bumping into him. And every time she shut a door, a new kind of ache settled into her chest. Because Claire didn't hate him. She liked him too much. And that was precisely the problem. She could already hear the whispers, imagine the assumptions if anyone found out, the small town gossip, the snide remarks. She's with him? Must be for his money. Must be something he's doing out of guilt or boredom. And maybe worst of all, the voice in her own head. You don't belong in his world. You never will. It was easier to cut the cord now, before anything more could form, before the hope in her chest could bloom into something harder to kill. But what Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, was that Julian had already noticed, and he wasn't going to let her disappear without understanding why. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Julian Cross decided he'd had enough of guessing. For 2 weeks, Claire Whitmore had vanished. Not entirely. He knew she was still working at the library, still volunteering, still existing in the same savannah as him, but she had gone silent in all the ways that mattered. She hadn't responded to his texts. She hadn't returned to the cafe. She'd missed her follow-up appointment again. At first, Julian had told himself to be patient. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she had a lot going on. But when days stretched into weeks, and the distance between them grew sharper, colder, he knew it wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate, and it hurt more than he wanted to admit. He'd seen this before. Patients pulling away out of fear, out of shame, out of the quiet weight they carried on their backs for too long. But this didn't feel like fear of health, or even of vulnerability. It felt personal. And what haunted him most was that he didn't know what he'd done to push her away. So that morning, with no grand plan and no polished words, he walked into the small brick building of the Whitmore branch library where she worked. He wasn't dressed like a doctor, just a man in dark jeans and a button-down shirt, heart pounding harder than he'd like to admit. He found her behind the front desk, bent over a stack of new arrivals, hair falling over her face as she focused on organizing the spines alphabetically. She looked peaceful. Or at least she did until she glanced up and saw him. She froze. "Claire," he said gently, his voice low. She straightened, clutching the edge of the cart between them as if she needed it to stay upright. "Julian," she said, his name barely a whisper. "I hope it's okay that I came," he continued. "I didn't know how else to reach you." She looked around, as if checking for anyone nearby, then gestured toward a small reading nook tucked near the back of the room. They walked there in silence. Once they were seated, he didn't waste time. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm fine. You've been avoiding me." It wasn't an accusation. It was the truth, laid bare between them. Claire looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together in her lap. "I know. Why?" he asked, and his voice was softer now, quieter, as though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She hesitated, then exhaled slowly. Because this, whatever this is, it doesn't make sense. Julian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. What doesn't make sense? You, she said, finally meeting his eyes. You're a doctor, a brilliant one. You have a life that people only dream about. And me? I'm just Claire. I work at a library. I can barely make rent. I live a quiet, small life. I don't belong in your world. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at her. Really looked. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unshakable. You don't get to decide what world I belong to, Claire, or who belongs in mine. Her throat tightened. People will think I'm chasing you for your money. Are you? He asked. She blinked, startled. What? Of course not. Then why does it matter what anyone else thinks? Because it'll matter to you eventually, she whispered. Maybe not now, but later, when the novelty wears off, when the world catches up. And her voice cracked. I don't want to be something you regret. Julian sat back slightly, stunned by the rawness of her fear. Then he shook his head, a soft, incredulous laugh escaping him. What? She asked, confused. You're the first person in my entire life who's ever run away from me because of my money. She stared at him. He leaned in again, more serious now. Most people try to get close because of what I have, because of who they think I am. You're the only one who backed away. And that tells me more about you than you realize. Claire looked down again, unable to hold his gaze. It still doesn't change anything. You don't understand what it's like to feel like you're not enough. I don't? He said quietly. She looked up, surprised by the shift in his voice. I wasn't always this, he said, motioning vaguely to himself. I didn't grow up with privilege. My parents worked double shifts to keep food on the table. I got through med school on scholarships and barely their sleep. Everything I have now, I built. But that didn't stop someone I trusted from using me, from lying to me, from making me question if I'd ever be enough just as I am. Claire's breath caught. I've known what it's like to be invisible, to feel like no matter how hard you try, it's never quite enough. And I also know what it's like to find someone who sees through the noise, someone who doesn't care about the shine or the title, someone real. He reached across the space between them, not to touch, but to offer something unspoken. His presence, his truth. I don't want you to run anymore, he said. And I'm not asking you to leap into anything. Just don't shut the door before you see what's behind it. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Claire didn't answer right away, but she didn't leave either. And maybe that was enough for now. Claire had never thought much about her body until it began to betray her. At first, it was just fatigue, mild and manageable. Then came the headaches, sharp and lingering, the occasional nausea, the ache that wrapped itself around her lower back and wouldn't let go. But she had convinced herself it was nothing. Stress, probably. Dehydration. She'd been working long hours, hadn't slept well, had too much on her mind. She didn't want to worry Julian. She had already pulled him into enough of her emotional mess, and despite everything he had said in the quiet corner of the library, part of her still believed she needed to stay out of his world, not weigh it down. So she kept going. She pushed through her days, smiling when she needed to, shelving books with trembling hands, ignoring the tightness in her chest whenever she bent over to lift something. She didn't notice how pale her skin had become. She didn't pay attention to how little she was eating. She didn't tell anyone when the dizziness began to creep into her steps like a silent tide. Until one night, she simply couldn't ignore it anymore. She had stayed late at the library, helping close up after a late community event. The last of the attendees had filtered out. The lights were dimmed, and she stood alone in the quiet stillness, trying to breathe through the pounding in her head. The world tilted slightly as she locked the front doors, her keys slipping once from her fingers. She paused on the steps outside, taking in the cool air, telling herself it was just a passing wave. But when she stepped onto the sidewalk, her knees buckled. She didn't remember falling, only the sensation of her body giving out and the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. Then voices, strangers gathering, calling out, someone kneeling beside her, a phone dialing, sirens in the distance, a blur of lights. She woke up in a hospital room with the soft beep of a monitor beside her and the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the air. For a moment, she couldn't place herself, couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. She turned her head, slowly, carefully, and saw him, Julian. He was sitting in the chair beside her bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair was tousled. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were focused on the floor, jaw tight, with something between fear and frustration. Claire's breath caught in her throat. As if sensing her gaze, Julian looked up, and everything shifted. His face, so often composed and confident, cracked with something raw. Relief, worry, anger, emotion. "Claire," he breathed, standing quickly. "You scared the hell out of me." She swallowed, voice dry. "What? What happened?" "You collapsed on the street outside the library," he said, his voice low but steady. "A bystander called an ambulance. When I found out you were here, He paused, trying to contain the edge in his voice. "I came as soon as I could." Claire blinked, trying to make sense of his presence. "You didn't have to." "Don't," he said quietly, sitting again, closer this time. "Don't say that." Her chest tightened. She looked away. "I'm sorry." Julian leaned in slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Claire, you've been pushing yourself too hard. You were severely dehydrated, exhausted. Your body just couldn't keep up." She felt the weight of his words, not just the medical facts, but the deeper truth buried in them, that she had let herself fall apart without asking for help, that she had believed, somewhere deep inside, that she wasn't allowed to need anyone. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You have enough to deal with." His expression darkened. "What is it with you? And this idea that caring for you is some kind of burden?" "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, her voice trembling. I don't want you to feel responsible for me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Claire, this isn't about responsibility. It's about choice." She looked at him, unsure, and he continued, "I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you. Not out of obligation, not because you collapsed in the street, but because somewhere along the way, you became someone I don't want to imagine my life without." Claire's eyes filled with tears, the truth of his words cutting deeper than anything else could. "But I'm a mess," she said softly. "I don't have your confidence or your world. I'm still trying to figure out how to stand on my own 2 feet." Julian's gaze didn't waver. Then let me stand beside you until you do. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in her life, she felt something deeper than fear or loneliness or shame. She felt seen, and for the first time, she let herself believe. Maybe she didn't have to go through life alone. Recovery was a quiet thing. There were no grand declarations, no sudden transformations, just slow mornings and short walks, moments of silence where the world held its breath, and unexpected glimmers of peace that came and went like the tides. Claire Whitmore spent the days following her hospitalization, moving more gently through the world, learning to listen to her body, honoring the spaces where she had once pushed herself too far. Julian was never far. He didn't hover or intrude. He showed up in quiet ways. A text in the morning asking how she slept, a warm container of soup left at her doorstep, a message slipped into her library Dropbox with a note recommending a novel he thought she might like. He never pressed, never demanded. He simply made room, space for her to come back to herself, and for him to be part of that process if she chose. Claire found herself reaching back. At first, it was small things, a thank you text, a short conversation over coffee. But as the days passed, she began to trust him with more. The way her mother used to call her too sensitive for the world, how she'd spent most of her adult life convincing herself she didn't need anyone, how lonely that belief had become. Julian didn't flinch at any of it. He listened with the kind of attentiveness that made her feel like she wasn't just being heard, but understood. One Saturday morning, he invited her to visit a community garden on the outskirts of Savannah. It was part of an outreach project funded by the Cross Wellness Foundation, an initiative focused on women's health education and access in underserved neighborhoods. Claire almost declined out of instinct, but something inside her, the part that was growing stronger, braver, said yes. The garden was alive with color. Rows of herbs, vegetables, and flowering plants spread across an open lot once forgotten. Children darted between sunflowers. Volunteers organized boxes of produce. It was vibrant and real, the kind of place that pulsed with purpose. Julian introduced her to the director, a woman named Naomi, who spoke passionately about the impact of the project. Claire listened, quietly moved. It wasn't just about food. It was about empowerment, giving women control over something as simple and sacred as nourishment. She'd never seen this side of Julian before. Not in action, not like this. Later, as they sat beneath a shaded trellis, sipping iced tea and watching the sunlight spill across the soil, Claire turned to him. "You don't just talk about helping people. You do it," he shrugged, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I got tired of talking. My mother used to say that healing doesn't start in a clinic. It starts in the community." Claire looked down, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I wish I knew how to help like that." Julian's eyes found hers. "You already do. You listen. You care. You made me think about the world differently the day you handed me that book at the fair." Claire laughed, soft and unsure. "That was just a novel." "No," he said gently. "It was a story. And sometimes that's how healing begins too." It was the first time she let herself believe that maybe she wasn't as small as she thought. In the following weeks, Julian invited her to be part of a new event the foundation was planning, a wellness fair that would include free health screenings, workshops, and local authors reading stories about resilience. Claire hesitated, but Julian assured her she could be involved in any way she felt comfortable. she agreed to help with the reading corner. The day of the event, she stood beneath a white canopy tent, a table filled with children's books and memoirs beside her. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Parents came by with toddlers. Teen girls lingered at the table, flipping through poetry collections. Claire spoke with them, shared titles, asked what they liked to read. It was simple. It was quiet, but it mattered. And Julian, he watched from a distance at first, giving her space. Then later, he joined her under the tent, his presence warm and steady. At one point, as they stood side by side, watching a young girl read aloud to her little brother, Julian leaned closer and whispered, "You look happy." Claire didn't respond right away. She looked at the girl, at the boy's wide-eyed expression, at the book stacked neatly in her hands. "I am," she finally said, for the first time in a long while. It was more than just a moment. It was a turning point, because in that garden, in that tent, in those small acts of showing up for others, Claire began to rebuild something inside herself. Not just health, not just hope, but a quiet, resilient kind of strength. And Julian never asked her to be anyone else. He only showed up and waited for her to realize she was already enough. The shift happened so gradually that Claire almost didn't notice it. There was no single day when everything suddenly became clear. No defining moment when she declared herself healed, ready, or whole. Instead, there were small, quiet victories. Waking up without dread in her chest, catching her reflection and not immediately looking away. Smiling, unprompted, just because the light through the window was warm and the air felt kind. And somehow, in the middle of that quiet becoming, Julian was there. He never pushed. He never asked her to name what was building between them, but he showed up, over and over. In the way he brought her a copy of a newly released novel because the blurb reminded him of her. In the way he'd wait outside the library at closing just to walk her home without saying a word about it. In the way he'd look at her, really look, like she was something rare and valuable, not despite her quietness, but because of it. One afternoon, Julian invited her to visit a new space his foundation had just leased in a nearby neighborhood. It was an old community center, long neglected, now under renovation to become a wellness hub for women. Part clinic, part gathering space, part educational resource. The walls were still bare, the floor unfinished, but there was a spark of promise in every corner. He led her through each room with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't forgotten what it meant to hope. He talked about affordable screenings, prenatal support, nutrition programs. But more than the services, it was the intention behind it all that moved her. This wasn't just another facility funded by a wealthy benefactor. It was personal, rooted, human. "What made you choose this neighborhood?" Claire asked as they stood in what would become the reading and rest area. Julian glanced around. "My mother grew up 3 blocks from here. She always said healing starts with listening, that the best medicine isn't given, it's offered." Claire nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the space where a bookshelf would one day stand. "You're building something beautiful here. So are you," he said quietly. She looked at him, caught off guard. "Me?" Julian stepped closer. The air between them charged with something deeper than the moment. "You've spent your whole life believing you had to stay small to be safe. But you're not small, Claire. You're thoughtful, brave, steady. People find shelter in you, and you don't even see it." His words landed with the weight of truth. She wanted to look away, but didn't. I never thought I'd belong in something like this, she whispered. You don't have to belong in it, he replied. You are it. That evening, as they sat together on the steps of the center, watching the sun dip low over the city, Claire leaned into him without thinking. His arm curled instinctively around her shoulders, and she rested her head against his chest. For the first time, there was no panic, no fear that she was being too much or not enough. There was only quiet understanding and the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. In the weeks that followed, they prepared for the center's soft launch. Claire helped coordinate the first community event, a day of open workshops, free checkups, and storytelling circles led by local writers. It wasn't just a clinic. It was a celebration, a declaration that care could be holistic, dignified, and tender. She read aloud to a room full of women and girls, sharing a short story she had written about a quiet heroine who found strength in the stillness of her own mind. When she finished, there was silence, then soft applause. Julian stood in the back, eyes shining. Afterward, one of the younger girls approached her and asked how she knew how to write someone like that, someone who didn't fight with fists, but with gentleness. Claire knelt beside her and said, "Because that's how I've always wanted to be seen." And that was the moment she realized she already was. Later that night, Julian and Claire walked side by side through the empty building. The laughter and voices of the day still echoed faintly in the walls. They stopped at the same place they had stood weeks before, in front of the soon-to-be reading corner. Julian turned to her, something unspoken in his eyes. "This place feels different now." "It feels alive," Claire said. He nodded. "Because you brought your light into it." She smiled, quiet but sure. For the first time, she believed him. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to, because something had rooted itself between them. Something deeper than attraction, stronger than infatuation. It was belonging, not just to each other, but to something larger, a shared life, a shared purpose, a future neither of them had planned, but both had begun to imagine. 1 year later, Claire Whitmore found herself standing at the edge of a cliff in Monterey, California, the sea roaring below like it had something sacred to say. The wind tugged gently at her hair, carrying the scent of salt and eucalyptus, while the golden light of late afternoon painted everything in a soft, forgiving glow. She hadn't expected this, not the trip, not the silence between them as they walked the trail from the car, and certainly not the way her heart beat faster with each step beside Julian Cross. He had asked her to take a weekend off. No context, just a simple invitation. "Let me show you something that matters to me." She had said yes, because saying yes to Julian had become something she didn't question anymore. Somewhere along the way, fear had given way to trust, and trust had softened into love. Not the sudden, breathless kind, but the kind that grows slowly and roots itself so deeply you forget what life was like before it. Julian stopped a few steps ahead of her, near the edge of a low stone overlook, and turned. His hands were in his pockets, but there was something nervous in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "This is where I used to come when I was in med school," he said, his voice quiet beneath the wind. "Any time I felt like giving up, I'd drive out here. Just to remember there was more to life than fluorescent lights and textbooks." Claire stepped beside him. The view was breathtaking. Waves colliding against the rocks with wild precision, the the sun dipping toward the horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I always thought if I made it, really made it, I'd come back here with someone who reminded me what all of it was for." She turned to look at him, something stirring low in her chest. Julian slowly pulled something from his coat pocket, a small velvet box. Claire stopped breathing. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring that sparkled not with extravagance, but intention. "I didn't know the first time I saw you that you'd change my life," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion swimming behind his eyes. "I just knew there was something different about you, something quiet but powerful, something that made me want to be still long enough to listen." Tears welled in Claire's eyes before she could stop them. Her hands trembled. "You've shown me a kind of strength I never knew I needed. You've taught me patience and honesty and how to find beauty in the softest parts of the world. You've let me into your fears and your healing. And in all of it, Claire, you've never asked for anything in return." He took a slow breath, then knelt on one knee, the ocean roaring behind him like applause. "So now, I want to ask you for something. Not because I need to, but because I can't imagine not asking. Claire Whitmore, will you marry me?" The tears spilled over. For a long moment, she said nothing. Not because she was unsure, but because every part of her heart was full to the point of bursting. The woman who once ran from connection, who thought she wasn't enough, now stood here, anchored, loved, and seen. She nodded through the tears, her voice catching. "Yes, yes, I will." Julian stood and pulled her into his arms, laughter mingling with emotion as they held each other beneath the open sky. In the distance, gulls cried, and waves sang their endless song. But in that moment, all Claire could hear was the sound of his heartbeat against hers, steady and true. They didn't rush to leave. They stood there for a long time, arms around each other, the weight of the moment settling gently between them like an old friend. When they finally returned to the car, Claire caught Julian looking at her the same way he had that first day in the exam room, like she was something rare and quietly extraordinary. And for once, she didn't shrink from it. She let it in. Months later, when they stood hand in hand at the opening of the Women's Wellness Center they'd built together, Claire told her story to a room of strangers. Not the fairy tale version, but the honest one. About fear, about finding courage in unexpected places, about how love hadn't saved her, but had reminded her she was worth saving. And Julian, standing beside her, didn't need to say a word. His presence said it all. In the end, their story wasn't built on grand gestures or perfect beginnings. It was built in the in-between moments, the silences, the small acts, the steady choosing of each other again and again. Because real love, the kind that lasts, doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives like the tide, patient, consistent, and impossible to ignore. And in that quiet, enduring rhythm, Claire and Julian found everything they'd never dared to hope for. Claire Whitmore's story began in silence. Quiet routines, quiet fears, and a quiet belief that her life wasn't meant to be anything more than manageable. A reserved librarian from Savannah, she had spent most of her life staying in the background, hiding behind books and self-doubt, convincing herself that vulnerability was weakness and love was something reserved for other people. Louder people, bolder people, more confident people. But everything changed the day she walked into Magnolia Women's Wellness Center and met Dr. Julian Cross, A man who, on the surface, seemed to embody everything she feared: success, wealth, charisma, someone who belonged to a world far more polished than hers. Yet beneath the accolades and the tailored shirts was a man just as scarred, just as careful with his heart, just as afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons. What followed wasn't an instant romance. It was a slow unfolding through awkward conversations, emotional distance, moments of collapse, and quiet acts of care. Claire ran. Julian waited. Claire fell. Julian caught her. And somewhere between their shared vulnerabilities and personal growth, they began to see each other for who they truly were. Not as roles or images, but as whole human beings, deserving of love, not despite their brokenness, but because of their willingness to grow through it. Julian didn't rescue Claire. He never tried to fix her. Instead, he gave her space to heal, to rediscover her voice, and to walk toward him on her own terms. In return, Claire offered something rare, the kind of love that doesn't ask for perfection, only presence. Together, they built not just a relationship, but a shared purpose, giving back, uplifting others, and creating a wellness center rooted in dignity and empathy. Their love story culminated not in a grand spectacle, but in a deeply personal moment on the cliffs of Monterey, where Julian asked Claire to marry him, not because she completed him, but because she had chosen, again and again, to show up, to love, and to be real. And she said yes, not out of a fairy tale fantasy, but from a grounded, wholehearted knowing that she was ready. The lesson? Sometimes, the most extraordinary love stories begin with ordinary people who dare to be seen. This isn't just a story about romance. It's a story about courage, about the bravery it takes to step out from the shadows of self-doubt, about trusting that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the birthplace of connection. So how can we apply this in our lives today? Start by giving yourself permission to be honest, with others and with yourself. Let people in, even when it's uncomfortable. Show up for your own growth. Say yes to the things that scare you, because they just might lead you to something beautiful. And most of all, remember, you don't have to be perfect to be loved. You just have to be you. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment where stepping into your vulnerability changed everything? How do you relate to Claire or Julian's journey? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or made you believe in love and second chances again, don't forget to likes, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating heartfelt, soul-stirring content just like this. Until next time, keep believing in love, in healing, and in the power of showing up.